Good morning, everyone. All of you following us here on the social media world, and as well as those following us on Zoom. Good morning to our students from the Portuguese 1A class from California State University, Fresno. Good morning to those following us here in the West Coast of the United States and Canada. And basically, good afternoon to those following us in the East Coast of the same two countries. And good evening to those who are following us in the Azores or mainland Portugal or any other part of the Portuguese-speaking world. This is the 48th conference of the Luso-American Education Foundation. Began a long time ago, almost 50 years ago, and this is our fifth time hosting it through PBBI at Fresno State. This is actually my, I believe, 14th time organizing it or co-organizing it, but at Fresno State, since the pandemic, we've been organizing it. It's a transition to completely online, but it's offered us a new markets and new opportunities and for folks in different parts of the country. It was very nice yesterday to reach the amount of people that we reached. But besides that, it was very interesting to get some messages from different parts of the country, especially from states that we normally don't associate with Portuguese Americans. We got a couple of notes from Illinois, of all places, where I don't think there's a lot of Portuguese other than Carlos Matos in Chicago. But there was a couple from Illinois, from Texas, we know, and quite a few people from Hawaii, which is always wonderful to have the folks in Hawaii follow us as they are always trying to rediscover their roots because it's a very old immigration. So we're happy to have you here. Once again, welcome to all the students. I think just about all of the students are on today, which is great. We are happy to have on this theme of roots and routes to discuss basically a book that came out already. Exactly when, I will have to look, but it's been, I've read it and it's full of notes, mine, so you can't see mine. You can see it, but you cannot see the interior because Esmeralda might say, "What did you do to my book?" But so this is the book, How to Clean a Fish. So Esmeralda Cabral is a Canadian of Azorean birth, who immigrated to Canada with her family at a young age in her childhood. And like many of us throughout the United States and Canada, especially those who immigrated in the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, many of them came with their parents at a young age. And so Esmeralda lives in Vancouver, and she wrote this wonderful book that I mentioned to my class, How to Clean a Fish and Other Adventures in Portugal. First of all, welcome. Thanks for taking time.
Thank you, Denise. It's always such a pleasure and a treat to chat with you.
Thank you. Thank you for so much. So let's begin a little bit about your story, if you don't mind, just a little bit. You're originally from the Azores. I know you didn't immigrate originally to Vancouver, but it was to Canada. And so tell us a little bit from just a recap of your personal bio, if you don't mind.
Okay. So yes, we came in 1969, and at the time you had to be sponsored. So my uncle sponsored us, and he had come, I think he might have come like in 1955, maybe. So in the early days here in Canada, and he lived in Edmonton, which is in Alberta, the next province over. So that's where we went to this landlocked city, which was a bit of a shock. We knew it was in the middle of this province, but had no idea that it was like 1,000 kilometers to the ocean. So we came from San Miguel to Edmonton, and I lived there for 23 years. That's where I did my university, my schooling, and then yeah, moved to Vancouver in 1992. So I've been here since. Yeah, and eventually my parents came and my sister, everybody came, but yeah.
And so, we'll talk a little bit about the book, How to Clean a Fish. But normally we, and that's what our major topic is going to be. But normally when one writes, you just don't get up in the morning and say, "I'm going to write a book." So has writing been something that you come from a family of writers? Your cousins with Edwin Jesus, but and others. Your cousin also, who is a painter in the Azores. I can't think of his name. Manuel.
Emmanuel, yeah, and
Yes,
Avelina, yeah.
who also writes as a journalist and also writes. So, how did writing come to you? Is it something that you've experienced from a long time, or how did that take an interest in your life?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've always wanted to write, and when I was starting university, that's kind of what I wanted to do. But you had to submit a portfolio, and I was too shy, and I didn't want to do it. But my mom and Edwino actually were very close. They were cousins, first cousins, and I would say to my mom, "I really want to be a writer," and she'd say, "Oh yes, you could be like Edwino." She's we have poets in the family. So it was never anything that was discouraged. If anything, my mom was always, my parents were always very encouraging, but because my mom had this close relationship with Edwino. So I never became a poet. But she was always, yeah, encouraging. So I always, wrote things down and wrote in a journal, and I'd write the odd article here and there. It was always in me, I think. And then yeah, later in life after, so I was in, I did environmental studies, so I worked as a consultant for many years. And then when I left that, I thought, what do I do now? And I started pursuing writing um, more regularly. And then, yeah, it's become my life now, right? Really.
And
Mm.
so this book, this wonderful book, How to Clean the Fish, this resulted from a trip. And actually, just on the back, Onésimo Teutónio Almeida, well known from the island of São Miguel, who is now actually spending most of his time back in São Miguel now, but taught for many years did his PhD and taught at Brown University. And he wrote, and I quote, these pages are as delicious as the Portuguese food the author so enthusiastically writes about. She is well versed with food, fado, the language, and even soccer. But she has to negotiate how to feel somewhat at home in the complex web of subtle Portuguese ways. So this book resulted from a trip, a long trip, a stay in Portugal that you and your family did, correct?
That's right. Yes. So my husband, Eric, at the time worked at the university, and he was, every time we'd go on sabbatical, I was always secretly hoping we'd go to Portugal. And then, sure enough, for the last one, he had an opportunity to go to the Universidade Nova, I think, de Lisboa, which has a campus in Costa da Caparica. So we were there for about 9 months. And and we took our family and our dog and just relocated there. And I had thought that it was going to be old hat. Oh, we're going to Portugal. I can speak Portuguese. It's going to be super simple. And we had our challenges, as you will know if you've read the book. So it actually caused me a lot of pause to think about, you know, what it must have been like for my parents who came to Canada without speaking English, without, any of those amenities that I had access to. And, it was hard for us. So I can't actually even begin to imagine what it must have been like for them. So it was a time for me to do a lot of reflection. Um, and I was just journaling. And actually, I'll just tell you that the inspiration came from I had met Philip Graham at one of the Disquiet workshops. I did a travel workshop with him in Lisbon, and then read his book that was called Dispatches from Lisbon. I think it was The Moon Come to Earth, Dispatches from Lisbon. So I had that in the back of my mind because Phil wrote that while he was on sabbatical in Lisbon. So I kind of had that in the back of my mind, and I thought, oh, maybe my journal entries will become a funny book at some point. So it was kind of in the back of my mind, although I didn't set out to write a book. It wasn't until I got back that I decided to put it together in a book. But yeah, that's kind of the seeds of how it happened.
And so, when you came back, you decided to put it in a book form. And publishing a book is a task, obviously, and a half. And this book was published by the University of Alberta Press. So, how how were those contacts? I mean, it's sometimes, Portuguese American authors and Canadian American authors, North American authors of Portuguese background, sometimes don't have all the connections, but obviously the book was well received as a manuscript that the University of Alberta Press was able to was able to publish it, and in a excellent quality. So was that also a new process for you, obviously, or
Oh, yes.
okay?
It's a whole different world. And first, I'll say that I was thrilled that U of A Press picked it up because that's actually where I did my first degree. So I was really quite thrilled, although there was no connection really. And I went the long route through the publishing process. So I have to mention here the connections I had with your group and Presenza and Disquiet, and everybody's quite supportive. And yeah, so when I started, when I had the actual manuscript and I was ready to query it, I sent it to 22 Canadian publishers. So I did want to start in Canada because it feels more contained. When we think about publishing in the US, it just feels so huge. So I wanted to start with Canada, and I sent it to 22, and I heard back from 18. But in the end, you know, so I sent it out in March of 2020, believe it or not, just before everything shut down with the pandemic. So it took quite a long time. I didn't hear back right away, and the world was such a chaotic place then. But eventually, there were two who were interested. But U of A, I appreciated the connection I had, and um, and they were more prompt getting back to me. So yeah, so the others were all rejections. So I'm very familiar with the process. And in fact, I tell people, I said one day I got 3 rejections on the same day. So that was a difficult day. But I'm afraid it's part of the process. I'm just so lucky and thrilled that U of A picked it up. In fact, I asked them. I said, it feels like a lot of luck. And I asked the editor. I said, "Oh, what was it that made you pick mine?" And she said, we've been sitting at the table. Her father's an immigrant from Europe. And she said, we'd been sitting at the table and he mentioned something about, oh, how he longed to go home. And she said it just twigged that she had read that in my proposal. And that was she went back to it and read it. So it feels like such a moment of serendipity that she picked that and he said that. And so I think the publishing process in Canada anyway is like that. There's a lot of hard work involved and also some luck, I think.
Sure. There always is. Um, So the book is divided into seasons, basically, which is winter, and you have it in Portuguese as well, spring and summer. It ends with some fun recipes and lots of info. And you start actually with a text about the word saudade, which you explain very well. For the Portuguese, as you know, love to say that it's untranslatable and unexplainable, but I think everybody has their own kind of saudade, whether it may be a unique word to us, but longing and this sense is something that a lot of people feel. But you talk about it from your experiences, and so when I read the book and jotted down a lot of thoughts about it, it's kind of like it made it I enjoyed the aspect that you're kind of rediscovering who you were in a way by living these adventures with your family in Lisbon. And I saw in many of the things that you described and talked about, and the foods and the fado and the beach and everything else, that there was a sense of Azorianness, even though you're writing the book in mainland Portugal. It seems like it was your journal of what was happening, but at the same time, you're bringing in, which I enjoyed tremendously, a lot of memories and a lot of experiences from your life, whether it be in the Azores or as an immigrant. So it's a different take, obviously, than someone going to a country that they know nothing about and then decides to do a journal about it. So was that, I mean, how important was that, your Azorian roots, in being able to write a book like this about living for prolonged amount of time with with family, with your husband and your kids joined you and everything else? And so, did having the roots in the Azores what kind of perspective you think it gave you about
Mm.
learning about mainland Portugal? Because it's a different society in some ways. I mean, San Miguel is a beautiful island, but it's different than Lisbon. And I feel, as I went through this book, that there was lots of Azorian things in there, even though you're talking about mainland Portugal.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, well, there's a lot there to unpack, Denise.
Yeah, we could probably talk about that question for 3 hours and write a master thesis on your book, but
Yeah. Um, of course, like I guess I don't, when I was writing it, I don't set out to write it, um, as Azorian, as Portuguese, as Canadian. I just wrote what was in my heart, really. And, having my roots in the Azores is just part of who I am. So of course it's going to be through that lens. Um, I was thrilled to go to Portugal when Eric had this opportunity, but I know being from San Miguel, that we speak differently. The landscape is different. In Costa de Caparica, it was sand and sand dunes and beach, whereas I'm from the rocky seashores of Lagoa in San Miguel, right, with the black lava rock. So the landscapes are different. The accent is different. And to some extent, the foods are different. And yet there was something there that just felt like it was similar. And maybe it was the language, even though there's a different accent, it was the language. And it just felt like my place. So I hope the Azorianness comes out because that's who I am. Um, and I'll just take a moment to say something about Saudade because it's a loaded word that seems to have become um, problematic lately. Of course, when I wrote this, which was almost 10 years ago, or that particular piece, it was not. It didn't feel that loaded to me at the time. But I've since thought a lot about it, and I think people in Portugal say, "Oh yeah, Saudade is kind of cliche," and some people here, but I think it's uniquely diaspora thing. And I would even hazard to say that it's still a big part of me because I'm in that in between in the diaspora. Like I didn't come as a working person, I came as a child, but also I wasn't born here. So I've got that in betweenness that I think is unique. So that is also part of me because I remember my parents, having this longing, but it wasn't like we were pining. It was just this sense of you are not where you're from. You're not living in the place where you're from. So yeah, some may say it's untranslatable, and I think I say that in the book, and now
you do a
it's
good job
problematic.
translating it
Thank you. Yeah, it's
and
it may be
explaining it.
it may be cliche, but it's also it's my life, right? It's part of who I am. Just like, I can't be anyone else. I can't write from another perspective. I can't look at Saudade academically or intellectually. It just is part of me. So I write just what comes to me, and then I hope that the reader will read it from their own lens, right? So
Indeed, and you mentioned here in the opening, I just read this one little part here. As an adult and an immigrant, so that is part of me. I long for my island home, for the Azores and from Portugal, listening to fado or eating a typical Portuguese meal. Talk about how that brings some saudade to it. But the way you describe saudade, I think, is a fresh new approach because sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong or if you don't agree with it, sometimes the cliche in Portugal is that saudade is, and I will say the words in Portuguese and then try to translate them to English, sofrida e penada. You know, it's like, it's just like too much suffering and too much sadness, basically. And and you look at Saudade from a fresh, different aspect, and obviously you're a much better writer than I am. But when we talk about Saudade, I was just asked this in Portuguese in the Azores, in your beautiful island of San Miguel, by a writer, a poet, Sidonia Betancourt, who is also a radio
Mm.
personality there. And Sidonia asked me, how do you feel? I said, I like Saudade. I like to have Saudade, because he kind of looked at me funny, because you're not supposed to like Saudade. I mean, in a way, but I said, no, Saudade means, when I have a Saudade, missing the Azores, as you put here, longing, long for my island, for the Azores, for Portugal. It kind of reminds me that there's still Portugueseness in me, even though
Mm.
here 55 years, in the United States, and came at the age of 10. But I like when I have that, and that's what I got out of that introduction that you did. It's not a
Mm.
sofrita y panada. It's not just, really totally suffering and totally cliches in a lot of ways. And that's what I think people in Portugal, but sometimes people in Portugal don't understand that we can feel a saudade that is healthy and that is not sofrida y panada.
Yeah,
Uh,
thank you for saying that, because I think that's exactly it. And for me, it was also a way to try to explain to my friends what, because I came when I was 7, and still people will say, "Oh, Esmeralda's, Portuguese, or Esmeralda's from the Azores," and I've often pondered, like, what is it about, how is it that I still identify that? Because I just had my 55th anniversary of coming to Canada too, so. Um, yeah, there's something in there, but I guess I was raised Portuguese in Canada.
sure.
Um, and so yeah, that's I don't know the Saudade from the dreary days of Salazar in San Miguel, like I just know the Saudade here, here going, oh, I'd like to be swimming in that swimming hole in the Piscina de Lagoa, so it is a different sense for me, but wow, I have had so many comments on that particular chapter, and I don't know if it was wise to start with it, but
Oh, it was. I think it was
yeah.
wise, because I think it sets the tone for what it sets the tone for the other writing that you did on the actual living experience
Mm,
in Lisbon. I think it kind of, explains to the reader, that, I'm looking at my journey, through this lens. And so,
thank
and I,
you.
think- and I think it's a genuine lens. It's not, I mean, nothing against travel writers, but it's not like you were just sent to Portugal on an assignment by magazine XYZ to,
Mm,
to write, some articles about the Azores, which, that is also good writing as well, and it's important writing. But you mentioned on or part of it that because you talked about, the having saudade and living in Canada. You said, I am the daughter of Portuguese parents. I am the mother of Canadian children. I am the link between two places and two cultures, and therefore I am both Portuguese and Canadian.
mm.
And how you conjugate those two without, because sometimes people say, oh, I can't just be both. I got to be one or the other, or I'm more this or more the other one. But in the book, the way, all of the different adventures, to use your title, all of the other adventures that you go through, some of them funnier than heck, and some of them very Portuguese, but, especially when it comes to the bureaucracy that you described so well. The post office one is just great. And so the story, you're looking at it, you seem like you balance these two well. That, they're not a being Portuguese doesn't weigh you down as a Canadian, and being Canadian does not weigh you down as being Portuguese. It seems like there's an even keel there. Do you feel that personally?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, most of my life has been in Canada, right? So I'm very Canadian in my approach to things, and that was actually part of the interesting thing about going, because I thought, oh, I'm Portuguese, it'll be fine. But things like, the bureaucracy and I did, as a Canadian, I did notice that, Portugal is still more male oriented than Canada. So that was a bit, a bit startling. So, I mean, I'm both. I can't help, but my roots are Portuguese and Azorean, but uh, yeah, I'm both. But there are times when I feel distinctly Portuguese, and there are times when I feel distinctly Canadian. Yeah, and I like to note those. I had a friend, I did a book club thing on Zoom actually with somebody in Ontario, and a friend said, "Gosh, like, did you really think about all of this? Like, did you reflect about all of this?" She said, "I don't think that much about who I am." And maybe that's the writer in me, but I'm always sort of thinking, observing, analyzing, it's just who I am. So,
Yeah, I don't think a full Canadian without the Portuguese Azorean ancestry or roots, in your case, and even, childhood, could write this book. I think it had to be someone like you and that had those experiences, and you could kind of, in some ways, you know, even when you tackle the machoism of the Portuguese society, o machismo, you do it in a very well. First of all, Canadians are always known to be very polite, but you do it in a polite, but by the same token, you do it in an Azorean aspect, because what how I got it, and I may be reading too much into it, but how I saw some of those instances that's very clear. I mean, you do it in a subtle way, very elegantly, but they're there. Some of those very machos ways that the Portuguese society still, fortunately or unfortunately, from my perspective, unfortunately still is, but you do it from a perspective that is not an outsider. Uh, you're an outsider, but at the same time an insider because of the culture that you lived in the Azores and the culture that you lived, with having some connection, with the Portuguese Canadian world. So I don't think anyone else could write with that aspect. I mean, you dive into it, but you don't dive into it with cruelty, and or with it's
yeah, I don't think of
very
it with
well, it's very
cruelty.
well
Yeah.
done, but you do call it out in a very subtle and very intelligent way.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I think just one example as you were speaking that I thought of was, in the Portugal that I grew up in, when you got in a car, the men sat in the front and the women sat in the back. And it was so funny to me um, to slip into that automatically. I just did it. And it was actually, and I didn't even think that much about it. It was my kids who said, "Oh, how come this always happens?" And I thought, "Oh, yeah, like the Portuguese part of me was very comfortable with that, and I didn't think anything of it."
Good
It
point.
took my kids to say, "Oh, that's different." And then I thought, "Yeah, they're right." So the Canadian part of me noticed it, but it's not cruel. It's just the way it is. Some things are worth fighting about, others not, but some things are just, it surprised me how some things I just followed without, it was comfort. I just sat in it very comfortably without question. So,
Sure. And we noticed that obviously throughout the book. But I promised the students that you would read from the book, and
okay.
so we've been talking for almost a half hour, and we haven't had a reading. So if you don't
Okay.
mind, tell us what your parts you're going to read, and a little bit of reading from the book, please.
Okay. I actually, I did a bit of cutting and pasting. I thought I'd pick out a piece from a chapter called Spring Market Days, and I think it fits nicely with what we were talking about here. So, okay, so the three of us are me, my daughter, and my son, so George and Matthew. The three of us were sitting at the bakery near the main square, savoring our custard tarts, and I was sipping my coffee when we saw and heard a group of four men outside on the street corner having an animated conversation. They all looked roughly the same age and sported similar balding patterns. They were short, stocky men, and each one was wearing a short-sleeved dress shirt and jeans cinched to the waist with a belt. They were gesticulating wildly and pointing emphatically in different directions. One of them hit his forehead with the palm of his hand, then walked away for a few steps, then came back to the group. Their voices rose, then dropped, then rose again, their sentences punctuated with body language and mixed inflections. Around them, life carried on, and no one seemed interested in their conversation, except us. On our way out of the coffee shop, we walked past them, and Georgia asked if I could tell what they were talking about. Yes, I said, they're talking about the location of a particular restaurant. It sounds like they can't agree what street it's on. You're kidding, right? Matt said. They're fighting about that? They're not fighting, they're discussing, I corrected. It's a mistake I remember my friends making when I brought them home after school. Eventually, they would confide in me that it sounded like my family was always fighting. The men on the corner were obviously passionate about their opinions. That scene makes me feel like I belong here, I said to Matt and Georgia. I get that. I really do, Mom, Georgia said. You move your arms exactly like that when you're trying to explain something. Yeah, and you yell like that too, Matt said. They're not yelling. They're raising their voices for emphasis, I said. It's called inflection. We walked out into the market and I steered us towards the area at the back where about a dozen fishmongers had set up their stands. I was looking for kitapauzinhos. In the last few weeks, I had bought these several times and hoped they were still in season. The first time I bought them, I had told the fishmonger that I didn't know how to clean or cook the tiny fish. Ah, don't worry. We do that for you, she said. And then you just fry them in a little oil at home. Oh, but I'd like to learn to clean them myself, I told her. What on earth for? I'll do it. I'll be quick. How many do you want? That first meal of fried fish had been so simple to cook. When we sat down to eat, I had explained to my family how to take the fish apart, which part of the head to eat and which one to discard, and how to take the meat off the bone right to the tail. It had bothered me that I hadn't cleaned the fish myself, though. I felt like I was cheating. I remember my mother telling me many times that this was a skill I needed to learn. I had watched her do it so often, but I had never tried it myself. Maybe she believed she would have a lot of time to teach me, or I thought I'd have forever to learn from her. On this day, I found kitapauzinhos and asked for enough for 3 regular appetites and 1 very hungry teenager. The fishmonger looked at Matt, smiled, and started picking fish off the heap of ice on the table and throwing them into a bowl. You know, I'm going to be leaving soon, I told her. I'm kind of running out of time to learn how to clean fish. It's my goal before I leave, remember? Okay, she said. How about if I do most of them, you watch me, and then I'll leave a few for you to do at home. Sure, sounds great. Leave me a dozen or so. I inched up close to the counter and fixed my eyes on her hands while she ripped through the fish. Can you do a few slowly so I can absorb it? I said. She sighed heavily and turned to her partner, who was also standing there watching her, and said, See what I have to put up with? I have no idea why she's so adamant about doing this herself. She said all of this as if it was an imposition, but I could tell she was pleased with my request to learn from her. She looked proud of herself. She took 1 fish, gave me step-by-step instructions. You hold the head on both sides with your thumb and forefinger like this, then take the fish by the neck like this, watch me, and pull out the guts. If you do it properly, it's a quick 2-step process. She wrapped up my fish and weighed the package, then handed me the bill and said, I gave you a discount since I didn't have to clean them all. We left the market and headed towards the beach. As we passed the outdoor patio of one of the seaside restaurants, we saw the 4 men who had been discussing things earlier sitting together at the table. They were talking and laughing and looking focused on deboning their fish. I guess they found their restaurant, I said to Matt and Georgia. But let's keep going, because it sounds like they're talking about soccer, so things could get really heated. Thank you.
It's a wonderful piece, yes. And of course, fittingly for the title of the that you chose, and very Portuguese. That I probably and when I say Portuguese, it's because that's what I know. Also, an Azorian, that someone pretends to be bothered by something, and that you noticed, I think, being Portuguese, maybe someone else of another nationality would not. That, yeah, it's an act because she really is proud of doing that. She really is proud that you're and appreciative, I think, that you wanted to learn how to do this because it's something that not probably, younger Portuguese don't even want to bother cleaning a fish ever, you know.
Yeah,
And
well, and I should say in the book, I think I do say at that point, my kids both walked away. They were dying of embarrassment. How could their mother do this? And they felt really badly that this woman had said that. And I didn't feel the embarrassment. I thought she was quite happy. So
she,
yeah.
she was, it happens often in the Azores, and it just happened actually this May when I went with my wife and I went with our youngest son and his wife, and some things that, um, the waiters would say, our daughter-in-law would say, "Oh, they're kind of bothered by us." No, they're not. It's all an act. It's just, they know where we're coming from, and so I think you understood that. I mean, I still don't know how to clean a shisharu and
Yeah,
have
she
no,
shouts.
which is the same. We call them shisharus, but they're
That's
garapaus are
right.
smaller, as you know very well. But we call it shisharu in the Azores. But I don't want to learn. My mother wanted to teach me, but I didn't want to learn. Although I liked frying them and eating them. Um, so how was the experience? And you talk a little bit about that, but if you don't mind, since we have a lot of our students, how was the experience for your kids, and how old were they when this happened? That they also lived with you in Portugal for an extended amount of time. There's not just going on vacation for 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, so my daughter was, I guess she was 15, so in grade 10. And she came with us for the whole period. And oh, excuse me, my son was so he would have been 19. He turned 20 while he was there. But he stayed here and finished his university semester first and then joined us at the end. So he wasn't there for the full time. And so Georgia, because she was in grade 10, she actually had to do online schooling because here in Canada, grade 10, you have to have specific courses, and it wouldn't work to just put her in the system there. And also I thought it would have to be an international school so that she could get credit for grade 10. And we talked a lot about that. And then we decided she would just do online schooling. So I think that was a little bit lonely for her. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but it was lonely for me to watch her, be on her own. She did have a friend who went to visit, but other than that, and actually both of my kids are quite quiet. They're the introverts. I think I talk about that in the book too. So it was hard for them to make friends. So it was a very insular time.
Hmm.
And they didn't meet a whole bunch of people their ages. But it was a good time for us as a family. It was short enough that I think we could do that. If it was a lot longer, they'd have to integrate into society there, I think. Um, but I will mention that my son, who's now 30, is there right now, and he's been there for 8 months and trying to pick up the language. And yeah, I think that seed is there. He's always wanted to do this. And yeah, he's traveling all around the country, and I imagine he's integrating, he's there with his partner, but I imagine he's integrating in his own way. And, Georgia would like to do that at some point too. So I think the seed was planted, but the experience for them, I think, maybe they'll write their own book someday, but I think it was probably a little lonely. Yeah.
And you talk about this in the book in some ways, in a lot of ways actually, but what are 2 or 3 things that kind of were much different for you than you thought? Because well, let me preface this by saying, first of all, or asking, you had been to Portugal before, or the Azores
Oh,
before.
many times. Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So you had visited, especially your home island and Portugal itself. You mentioned this quiet, and everything else. And so the but this prolonged stay, where and you mentioned some of the things in the book, and besides the bureaucracy, besides some of that that is very present in all societies, but especially in some of the ways Portugal's bureaucracy is still Salazar's. Even though we're living in a democracy, it is still a very Salazar's uh, dictatorial type. I'm not saying dictatorship lives in Portugal, but I think people know what I'm talking about. The thing that you see at a government office or anything like that. But the how what were two or three surprises that that stand out, that you tell or don't tell in the book, but you tell quite a few of them. But what are two or three surprises um that come to mind from that state there that you thought, oh, this is different than that I envisioned,
Hmm.
if there are any?
Um, well, I think that's a hard question for me. I think the one thing that I was most struck about, and I'm going to get emotional, is just the hospitality that we received. And I think that is very similar in the Azores and Portugal. We did go for an extended period of time for 3 months to San Miguel, actually, but my daughter was a baby. So I didn't have time to journal. So I guess that's why the book didn't come out then. But so we've had two extended periods. But hospitality, I think, is a common thread, and just how much people were willing to help us. And sometimes we joke about how the Portuguese look very dour. Like I have friends here saying, "Oh, you can't be Portuguese because you smile so much," and I go, "Ah, ha, ha," right? But when you look around, generally people have this sort of serious look on their face and stuff, and you think that, like, you can't equate that with not being friendly, because once you get in, once you make that contact and they think of you as a friend, like, we are still in close contact with our landlord. Every time I go to Lisbon now, it says if we've never left. So that is surprising for me, because I can't say that that's common in my life, in my circles here. Like, it's just this, once you are a friend, you are a friend forever. And maybe there's something to do with the fact that we're a diasporic nation, so people are used to maintaining contact with people who live abroad, and you don't see them for years, and then when you do, it's like, come back, you're back, and um, so that, I think, is what has stayed with me a lot. One of the things that I didn't mention in the book, but I've since thought about, is just the energy consciousness of people in Portugal. They just do things differently. The laundry, the food, the cars now are mostly electric or hybrid, or it's just a different consciousness of energy that's different than my life here right now. Let's see, you said three things.
Oh, just a
I
couple
might
small.
have to leave it at
Oh,
two for now.
and I do, if I ever, have time and go to Portugal, I want to meet the landlord, because, he's in the book,
Amazing.
and
Yeah.
and amazing stories around, and of um of hospitality, of solidarity, of just, I think, trying really hard for you to have a sense of belonging there, and feeling at home, in
Yeah.
some ways.
Unfortunately, they don't speak Portuguese, but excuse me, my publisher sent them two books, and they have it up on their shelf, like on display, but they haven't read it. And I
Well,
say,
that
it's good,
comes
it's
up.
good.
That's good that they have it on this, but there's actually a question by our mutual friend and poet and awesome writer as well, Scott Edward Anderson, who's on, and he just asked the question, since you say that they're on display at the landlord's home, will there be a Portuguese version of the How to Clean a Fish?
Oh, hi, Scott. And actually, Scott was so instrumental for me, both Scott and Manuela Marujo, for me in getting this book published, because I'll just mention here quickly, with the academic press, they do send out the book to peer reviewers, and both Manuela and Scott were peer reviewers for my book. So yeah, part of the fact that this book is published is due to them. So thank you. In terms of Portuguese, I don't know. Like for me now, I think I could try and pursue some of those avenues, but it all has to go through the publisher because they kind of act as my agent. It's in the contract, so I've kind of signed all those rights away, and I haven't had a chance to pursue anything in Portugal. If I did, then I'd have to. I can't do it myself. I have to do it through the publisher.
Sure. And another book that we were talking about before we went on, which is this one, Voz e Netos, that Manuela Marujo and Aida Batista organized. You wrote a piece to your grandparents, Maria do Rosário e o António. I am sure that is your grandparents, and so it was in Portuguese. How was that experience for you? I mean, you've been writing mostly probably in English, you came at such a young age. But how was the experience with writing in Portuguese? And would you tackle your own translation or no?
Oh gosh, no. I think for that piece, and I think if Manuela is listening, she'll be very relieved to hear that I wouldn't translate my own. That piece has come about because of her hard work and determination to edit my Portuguese. I'm fluent in Portuguese, and I was thinking about yours and my roots or routes, I guess. In
Right,
Canada, we
roots
say
and routes. Yes.
Yeah, but, that you've maintained your Portuguese, more professional Portuguese more so than I have. So I'm fluent in conversational Portuguese. I can write to family and friends, but there's a specific way of writing that that I don't know very well. So I wrote my piece for Manuela in very much a conversational way, and so she edited it, and I had a lot of Azorianisms in there.
Good.
Because she would say, well, what's this? We don't say that here. And I had, like, part of the flavor that I wanted was, as Azorians coming to Canada, we have our own ways of saying things, like teenager becomes teenager. And so I wrote, TEENJA, and she said, what's this? And actually, I don't know if that made it to the final cut or not, but definitely some Azorianisms would creep into my writing in Portuguese, but that's not considered formal. So that process, that little piece took us quite a bit of time. I would not tackle my own translation for Portugal, but I would love for it to be translated, and I would love to read it in Portuguese to see what, I'm sure it'll have a different flavor.
Yeah, certainly will. But it would be, I think, an interesting book to be available in Portuguese, because sometimes the Portuguese themselves are kind of lacking in perspectives that others have, and especially others with the experience that you've had, the diaspora experience. There's not a lot of looking at Portugal from a temporary and a prolonged stay, but having been born, and spent a good bit of your childhood in the Azores, and then immigrating with your parents, and then that adjustment and everything else. So it's I believe it actually would be, a good book for the Instituto Camões and the government agency that deals with the diaspora, the Secretariat of Immigration, or not immigration anymore, just now communities now, to actually sponsor translation of it, because it gives a new look at the diaspora experience. A lot of the diaspora experience sometimes, and that's why I think this was refreshing. It was very refreshing. I just don't think I know it's refreshing. And and other perspectives. We're talking about Scott, Scott's perspective, from the third generation or fourth, actually, of only discovering his roots later on, and others as well. Our good friend that just commented on social media and wanted to say hello to you, Lada Goulart, who loved the book,
Oh, hi,
uh,
Laura.
a poet and dear friend of ours, and so. I think I think more and more the Portuguese nation would be a better place for everyone. And to have books like this translated into Portuguese so the Portuguese could look at how the diaspora is, again, I'll use those two words again, is not just sufrida y penada. I mean, it's a different diaspora. It's someone who immigrated as a childhood, became a professional, and in the environment, her degrees, decided to write, and decided to write as a way to express, like all writers do, not, just because, oh my gosh, I'm always suffering and I'm always, in this dark part of my life, which, we all go through dark and not so dark places in our lives, but that it's a different aspect because a lot of what has been written in the past, especially 40, 50 years ago, was a lot of by immigrants, was basically, first of all, in Portuguese, and second of all, with a lot of a heaviness and a heavy a soldat that hurts. I'm saying your soldat is a healthy one, and so I think it'd be great to have it published in Portuguese. So maybe
Oh, well, thank you.
we can
Yeah,
start talking about all these different things,
it would
between.
be a
Oh,
thrill for sure. That's yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, my experience is that when I speak to people there, they have no idea what it's like to be, part of the diaspora. And even when I'm talking to my family in San Miguel, they'll look at my kids and they'll say, "Oh, they're Canadian," and I go, "Well, yes, but they also identify as coming from the Azores." And so they're, I don't know, are they second generation or third? I don't know, but it's interesting that there is that in them as well. And I think that's something that people there just don't understand, how you can go away, because it almost feels like they want to be more, I'll say, Americanized, so I think they're surprised that we want to keep some of that identity. And also, I'll also say here that when I was traveling around mainland Portugal, that, they pick up my accent and they go, "Where are you from?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm from San Miguel." I was shocked at how few people I spoke to, like in shops and stuff, had actually ever been to the Azores. And I said, "Well, you should go sometime. Yeah, we speak differently there." um, speak
yeah.
differently, I guess, in San Miguel mostly.
Well, it's that doesn't surprise me. Just a quick little story. Years ago, but it hasn't been that many years. It's been maybe about 15, 18 years ago. I was there for a conference and we had issues with the planes, and went on. It wasn't SATA, so at least we won't bag on SATA. It was TAP, and we went through Lisbon. And there was a group of us, there was three of us, and we went through Lisbon, and we had to go back and forth because our plane was late from Newark, New Jersey to Lisbon, and so we missed our original plane. So the the nexus of the story is that we had to go through security, and it wasn't as rigid as it is now. So this was actually probably a little bit longer than 20 years ago because it was before September 11th where things
Mm.
changed in the airports. So probably 2000 actually, or 1999, and but the short part of the story is that we went through security like three times, and it was the same young lady. So she had seen us like three different times within a matter of like 30 minutes, and there wasn't that many people. The Lisbon airport wasn't like it was today. And finally, with this friend of mine who's from mainland Portugal, from Aveiro, said to her, "Why do we have to go through all this again? You just saw us, first of all. And second of all, I mean, we're going to Graciosa, you know, we're going to Graciosa." And she goes, "Where in the hell is that?"
Oh,
That
really?
hurt.
Yeah.
I had to explain to her that it's one of the nine islands of the Azores. Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Ouch. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so it's a different time. We're talking, like I said, it was probably 99 or 2000. So we're talking about, 24, 25 years ago. However, there still is, unfortunately, a lot of or people, for those students who are following, those of you who are following us on social media, as you know, when people say the Azorian accent, we actually have 9 different accents. Every island has its own accent. Terceira has an accent. We kind of sing along, when we talk. And so every island has an accent. But of course, the biggest island is São Miguel, and it's the one that's widely known. And there's been a lot of creativity out of São Miguel, Zeca Medeiros with the telenovelas that he's done,
Hmm.
and they projected in mainland Portugal and all over Portugal. And so when I go to Portugal, that happens to me. People say they know that they can tell by my accent that I have a little bit of an American. They say, where you live, and they always say, "Are you live in?" And they can tell pretty much, especially when you go to some of these conferences. Are you from Canada or the United States? I said, no, I'm from the States. I'm from California. And then, yeah, but you're born, yes, and where you
Yeah.
from? And I said, the Azores. You don't have the Azorian accent because I'm speaking Portuguese. You don't have the Azorian accent. What do you mean the Azorian accent? No, the accent that we see from the Zeca Medeiros telenovela. I said, well, but that's from one particular island. Every island has a different accent, and people in mainland Portugal don't get that. I don't think.
No, and actually, I'm just writing a piece about that now, about my Micalense accent, because I think I've always tried to, I mean, not put on a different accent, but I've tried to suppress it a little bit and speak, say the whole word and everything. And now I've given that up. I've decided I'm quite proud of it. And like João de Mello, someday I hope to write with the Micalense accent. It is different from all the other islands. It's different from mainland Portugal for sure, and it's uniquely ours. And I think, well, why would I want to hide that? It's a lot of people don't like it, but I love it.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And once you're proud where they're from. I have a question here from one of our students. We're coming up on the end here in the next 10 minutes or so, but and it's Caitlin asks, what influenced you to want to share your experiences with the world? And also, what advice would you give to someone who may want to visit the mainland Portugal where you went, for this book? Well, first of all, Caitlin, the advice: read the book. uh, 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 because there is lots of advice on here, and like we said, there's recipes, and it's a fun book in a lot of ways, but a very serious book as well. But so, what influenced you to want to share your experiences with the world?
Oh, thanks for that question. I don't know that I didn't set out to do that. I think once you start writing, I mean, I've been journaling, as far back as I can remember, but once you start writing for a different audience, I think it's a different kind of mentality. And so I started this as journaling, and I had a blog while I was away that I called Postcards from Portugal. And it was just a way of keeping my friends kind of up to date on what we were doing, so I wouldn't have to say the number of times. And it wasn't until I got back, I was walking with a friend, and she said, "Oh, you should turn it into a book." And I thought about Philip Graham's book, and I thought, "Oh yeah, I could do that." So it was kind of my idea to write this, yeah, memoir, but I called it my happy memoir. But then I left it for a number of years, and then I was going through a magazine at one point, and I saw an ad for a program for the MFA program in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, and the thing was, "Do you have a book in you?" And I thought, oh, maybe I kind of do. And actually, I signed up for the program and then used that as my work in progress. And so that was kind of how it evolved into a book. I didn't actually start by saying, "Oh, I want to write a book to share with everybody what my experiences were." But it also, I wrote my reflections, and then I started thinking, this might appeal to people who are like me, kind of in the middle of two worlds, and not just Portuguese. There's
Sure.
a lot of it. I hope that there's a lot of similarities in the immigrant story from many different countries.
I think there are, and I think there's one other question. One of the things I wanted to share, and because as I was reading your book, I thought of this several times. Not, and I may be reading something else, one of your other experiences, but I came when I was 10. I went back when I was 14 with my parents, which was a prolonged stay as well. My dad decided that he was going to go back to Portugal for 6 months and with the possibility of maybe returning, but that didn't happen. I mean, we came back to the
Mhm.
United States of not or of returning to the States and then going back a couple of years later. But anyway, we were there almost 6 months. And so I always tell my students I didn't finish the seventh grade or began eighth grade as I should. I
Oh,
finished seventh grade a month early and started the eighth grade a month and a half later. But but then we didn't go for a long time, and I went back already married with my wife, and I think I was like maybe 28 or 29. So I've always been I was in Portuguese journalism and Portuguese radio when I'm in my early 20s. So I was, but one of the strangest things, to be honest with you, when I went back and when I was like I believe 29, when I went back was that all these people around me speaking Portuguese, which I wasn't used to it. So I live in
yeah.
a community that speaks Portuguese, but I would only hear Portuguese at a festa, maybe. And so the rest of the time, my world was an American world, especially because I had left Portuguese radio at that time already. So my world was basically the American or English speaking world. And so it was strange to be in an area. And I recall like my second day in Terceira Island, I said, oh, geez, everybody's speaking Portuguese. Well, of course, I'm in a Portuguese speaking country. I'm back home. That's the way it's supposed to be. Sometimes that because although we live the diaspora, but I think the same thing probably with you, our main language is English.
Oh,
You
just
know,
as you're saying that, I think, oh yeah, just to be surrounded by the language just feeds my soul in a way that being, yeah, nothing else. Yeah. And I think it's different in California where you are than, in Vancouver. I have to say that unless I'm speaking to my sister, I don't hear Portuguese at all. And so when we go back to the islands and my family says, oh, why didn't you teach your kids Portuguese? And I go, because it would be like speaking in a vacuum. Nobody would understand. And yet, when I spoke to my parents, my family, I think the kids kind of had their ear tuned to Portuguese. So I hope that that means now that they're learning that it'll be easier for them. But it's really hard to carry on a life in Portuguese in a place that's English. So maybe I misstepped as a mom, but my husband doesn't speak Portuguese. Nobody does. So I don't know how to go about that.
it's not easy, and it's not, especially in the multi. I mean, a lot of people of our generation who taught Portuguese or their kids speak Portuguese. Mine do, but that's because we lived in a very, very Portuguese.
Mm,
My mom was the babysitter, and she made it a point to speak to him only in Portuguese because her English was not good. And so we had those pluses. I mean,
hmm.
I keep on saying that in the United States and maybe even some of the bigger area where, when I mean bigger, not necessarily larger than Vancouver, but with more Portuguese, like Toronto and some of the neighborhoods, etc. I think if it weren't for the grandparents, they were the ones that really, taught some of the
Hmm.
children. If they babysat kids, they taught them some Portuguese. In here in California, grandparents were basically our supports for
Yeah.
continuing the language past, a young generation that immigrated as young as we did. You know what I'm saying? And people that immigrated when they were 7, 8, or 9 or 10 years of age. I have a lot of my friends who came at the age of 6 and 7, and they don't speak Portuguese any longer.
Yeah,
So
and I think you got started with your family a lot younger
younger, yeah, much
than
younger.
I did. And
It was a
my,
different situation. Yeah,
yeah.
totally,
But
totally different. Yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say something, but I forgot. Anyway, yeah, it's hard. And oh, I know I did go back to Portugal in April, and I visited my son who was there at the time, and his girlfriend said, "You never told me that Matt speaks Portuguese," and I said, "Well, that's because I didn't know." And she said, "Yeah, he gets by," and so. I think he just didn't want to speak in front of me, but he's getting by. So, yeah, in some of those smaller places. So, he has had to learn, and maybe it's a harder route than if I had brought him up and, had the experience that your kids have. But I think when it's in your family, it's in your DNA somehow. And I think, I
Well,
don't know.
and he's discovering on his own, which is wonderful. I mean, he wants to do this. A lot of
Yes,
times,
yes.
some children learn also as Portuguese because their parents made it, but then they decided to abandon it, for one reason or another, because they were learning because mom and dad wanted them to learn. It's so great when you learn it and then you want to keep it, or when you didn't learn it but you want to go and discover it on your own as an adult. So that's
Hmm.
great experience. There's one more question before before we leave for today, and a couple of suggestions as well. But one question, which is, what advice would you give to someone? This is from one of our students, Crystal. What advice would you give to someone who wants to write a book?
Well, thank you for asking that. As a mom, I'm never asked for advice, so it's always kind of fun when to somebody who wants to write a book, just just start. I think that's the hardest part, is just start and just write. And then when you have enough writing, some I think this happened to me too. When you start writing little scenes, I guess, then there was a bit of an arc. I could see what the story arc was. And when you have a manuscript, the other advice I would say is maybe have a writing group or somebody who can give you feedback. Send it off to friends and just say, "What do you think of this?" And listen to their feedback, and then just, yeah, be in for the long haul, but get started, I think, is the main thing.
Someone
I,
also asked
I
where
don't know
they
if that's that
No,
helpful,
that's
but
great. Where they could buy the books. Well, you can buy the book, obviously, the big, this is not a plug, but, Amazon is one thing that a lot of people buy. So, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any of those big companies, you can order it online. I don't think here locally, we do have a local store in Fresno, but I don't think it has it. But if you do go there, I know a local bookstore in Fresno. If you do go there, or in any other, California town, and you tell them, the title of the book and where it's from, they can order it for you, so they can
I
get it.
think I do. I think the publisher does have a US distributor, so you should be able to order from anywhere. But
Yeah.
yes,
So yeah. So if you go to any bookstore that you know of in whatever town you live here in the Valley, in the Central Valley, or those following us, in other parts of the California, other parts of the United States, and Canada as well. If you go to your bookstore, if you'd rather buy from a local bookstore, basically just give them the title and the author's name, and they'll be able to order it for you. Or you can order online.
could I just add, it's not a guidebook though. I've had so many people write to me and say, "Oh, I picked this up because I was going to Portugal," and it's not a guidebook. It is a memoir, and it has travel stories. So it's not a do this, do that, go here, go there, but it's a memoir. So I will add that in case you want. Somebody had asked, "Oh, what advice do you have for going to Costa de Caparica?" My advice is to just be open. Go somewhere and be open to the experience. But in the book, there is no, eat here or eat there. So I just wanted to
Yeah,
put that.
and with all due respect, but I do think that those of you who are, wanting to even to go to Portugal, it's a good read to go before you go to Portugal.
Thank you.
You'll get a lot out of it. Sometimes guidebooks are, I'm not nothing against guidebooks. It's not a bang on guidebooks, do this, do that, do that. But you can go online and get that kind of information. Top 20 things to do in Portugal, and you'll and look for some reputable sites. I mean, if it's really a good travel magazine, or the New York Times or the Toronto Sun that has these lists, they're
Yeah.
usually, very well done. But this, from my perspective, and this is as a reader, not as a writer, as a reader, I think this is an important book and a good book to read before you go to Portugal, because you'll understand a bit more about the country from someone who is looking at it with a different lens. It's not someone who just left Portugal 5 years ago or 10 years ago, left Costa de Caparica and now returns to Costa de Caparica and writes a book about, living in Lisbon. And it's not someone who was paid by nothing wrong with that either, but it's not someone who was paid by a magazine to go over there and do a series of reports, a series of articles, and then all of a sudden, got the articles all together and did a book on it. So it is not a guide, but I think you'll get a lot more. I would basically tell everyone, um, that you're going to Portugal, read this book.
Thank you.
Not as a guide, but as a guide to living experiences,
Mm.
as a guide to maybe being at a cafe and understanding why they're speaking loud. It's okay. They're not fighting with each other. As you mentioned, and you read a little bit in your piece there that you know had a couple of things. So as a guide to understanding the Karapaus, as a guide to understanding if you have to go to the post office and look for something that's coming or sending something. So one never knows, even if one is only in Portugal for 4 or 5 days, one never goes, what experiences one may have or or what life will throw you when you're there. So I think I think memoirs, and in this case, a very a good memoir, a funny memoir, a book, that has all of this insight is important. You'll get a lot more out of Portugal if you read How to Clean a Fish Before You Go. That's my
Wow, high
like
praise indeed. Thank you
but it's
so
true,
much.
it's true, it's true, it's
Thank
true,
you.
it's
Yeah,
true.
I'm very humbled by that. Thank you.
It's very true. So there was also one other question before I know we're up on time, but what was the hardest part of the publishing part that you spoke about? What was the hardest?
Oh, the hardest part is just not taking rejection, not being dragged down by rejection, because unless you're a super writer and you only submit to one person who wants it already, you're likely to encounter rejection, and that's really hard. There were some days when I just thought, oh, so even now, as I write short pieces and submit them, some get accepted, but a lot don't. So when I get a rejection, I allow myself that day to kind of lick my wounds and say, oh, I'm a terrible writer, and blah, blah, blah. And then the next day I just get right back at it again. So I think that's hard. And also sitting down and doing it when around you people are doing other things and other fun things. Like, one of the shocking things for me was at the end to realize I had written 90,000 words. And I thought, how did I do that? Because I'm a bit scattered. But a lot of it was late nights or early mornings. And then, just sitting down to do it when more fun things are going on around you. I
Yeah.
think those are the hard parts for me anyway.
Yeah, there was one time a question that was asked of the famous writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. When do you get? Because a lot of people talk about inspiration, and I love his line, which is, "When do you get inspired?" He says, "When I sit my butt down in the chair and I actually start writing and write a bunch of stuff that later on I'll read and I don't want to publish, but actually my inspiration is sitting down and actually doing the work, and then revisiting it. And sometimes,
Yeah.
I mean, there are people who feel that they're better inspired, or I don't know if it's inspiration, but like to write early in the morning or late at night, or but I think indeed sitting down and writing, and um it's a very lonely kind of an art. I mean, it's not like you're writing with a lot of people around you and everything else. It's a hard job.
Yeah, and I'm not a writer that sits down for 4 hours every day and writes. I mean, I have, a family, a life, and so I write when I can. But I like to try and stay open to whenever I hear something, either music or a program on TV or the radio, or if I read something. And if it sets off some thoughts about things, I love the voice memo on my phone. I'll just speak that into the thing and record it. And then later, when I have time to write, I'll go back, because I feel like that's my muse, is conversations with people or hearing things or reading things. And if I don't write them or get them down right away, then I forget. But it's really hard to sit in front of a blank screen and say, okay, I'm going to write now. I can't do that, but I guess some people can.
It's right. It's hard. It is. Thank you so much, Esmeralda. Thank you to the students who have been with us. Thank you to those who are in the social media world. Thanks to all the groups. I think there's about 42 in the United States and Canada that carried it, and we appreciate that because
Oh,
some more
thank
people.
you.
The book again is How to Clean a Fish and Other Adventures in Portugal. One of the things that we established yesterday from some of the conversations we had was the need for a book club, and PBBI, I guess we'll probably start one. We'd love to
Oh,
have you in the book club. I think it'd be great to do an online. I mean,
oh, how fun. That would be, yeah, really
I think we
exciting.
need
Yeah.
to. There's people I've been approached for, actually two people from Hawaii and one from one of those from Illinois. That's not Carlo Matos, because that's the only person I know that's Portuguese in Illinois. But I'm sure there's more.
Hi, Carlo.
But yeah, and so um actually there's another writer that's from Illinois. I can think of the name right now. But anyway, Portuguese American. But it would, I think more and more we need to use, obviously not in a public venue, but in the technology to connect. And so hopefully, I'd like to have like three books, and certainly one of them will be your book. So we'll be in touch as far as getting
Oh,
some
that would be
information.
quite a
Yeah,
thrill. And
yeah. I think it'd be
it's
good for you.
always such a pleasure to chat with you, Denise. It's always fun and inspiring, and I'm gonna have to write some things down when I get off here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esmeralda. Thanks to all the students. Thanks to everyone who follow us. Best of luck, and keep on writing, because we need your writing.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.